Her wheat blonde hair had partially escaped its pins, framing a face both beautiful and desperate. "Don't come any closer," she warned, voice steady despite her trembling hands. She was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 20 at most, with eyes the color of summer sage. The child, a girl no more than 4, clung to her mother with tear-stained cheeks. Darby raised his hands slowly. "I mean no harm, ma'am. My ranch is just south of here. Saw your wagon." "It was the wheel," she said, her exhaustion evident. "My husband, her voice caught. There was a fever. I buried him 3 days ago. We were trying to reach his brother in Helena." The revelation struck Darby like a physical blow. A widow, a child, alone on the frontier with winter coming. Precisely the kind of situation he avoided, other people's tragedies, other people's needs. "Storm's coming," he said finally, looking at the darkening sky. "You can't stay out here." "We have nowhere to go," pride mingled with desperation in her voice. That was the moment, the crossroads Darby would later recognize as the turn in his carefully ordered life. He could ride away, alert the marshal in town to their situation, wash his hands of their fate. Self-preservation demanded it. Instead, he heard himself say, "I have a cabin. It's not much, but it'll keep you warm tonight." The woman studied him, weighing survival against the danger of trusting a stranger. Finally, she nodded. "I'm Penelope Whitaker. This is my daughter, Emma." "Darby Pine," he replied, extending his hand to help her up. "Let's get your belongings before that sky opens up." By the time they reached his cabin, the first fat snowflakes were swirling down. Darby led them inside, suddenly self-conscious of the sparse furnishings. A table, 2 chairs, a bed in one corner, cook stove, and little else that spoke of comfort or permanence. "You can take the bed," he said awkwardly. "I'll sleep in the barn with the hands." Penelope stood in the center of the room, her daughter clinging to her skirts. "Mr. Pine, I don't know how to thank you." "It's just for tonight," he said quickly. "Tomorrow I'll help you salvage your wagon, or take you to town if you prefer." But that night, the storm that had threatened all day descended with unexpected fury. By morning, 8 inches of snow blanketed the ranch, with more falling steadily. The mountain pass to Helena would be impassable for weeks, perhaps months. One night became 2, then a week. Darby moved a cot into the small second room he'd been using for storage. He ate his meals quickly and spent as much time as possible outside with the cattle, avoiding the strange domestic scene that had invaded his solitary existence. Yet each evening he found himself lingering longer at the table as Penelope told stories of her life before, a shopkeeper's daughter from St. Louis who'd married a would-be silver prospector with dreams bigger than his luck. Emma, initially shy, began to watch for Darby's return each day, rushing to the window when she heard hoofbeats. "She's taken quite a shine to you," Penelope remarked one evening, 2 weeks into their stay, as Emma finally dozed by the fire. "Children adapt easily," Darby replied, uncomfortable with the observation. Penelope's gaze was steady. "Her father was often gone, searching for silver claims. She starved for a man's attention, I think." The statement hung between them, heavy with implication. Darby stood abruptly. "I should check on the horses." Outside in the crisp night air, Darby leaned against the barn door, breathing deeply. This arrangement was temporary, a necessity forced by weather and circumstance. Come spring, they would leave for Helena or wherever else fate took them. He wouldn't allow himself to grow attached to the small family sheltering under his roof, yet something was shifting in him, subtle as a change in the wind. He found himself thinking of improvements to the cabin, a proper second bedroom maybe, perhaps a garden come spring, the kind of thoughts a man has when he's building something permanent, not merely surviving. The next morning brought clear skies but bitter cold. Darby and Theo rode out at dawn to check on a pregnant heifer, finding the animal in distress. "We'll lose her and the calf both if we don't get her to shelter," Theo said grimly. For hours they struggled to move the frightened animal through deep snow. When they finally returned to the ranch house, exhausted and frozen, Darby was unprepared for the sight that greeted him. A hot meal on the table, the cabin tidied, and Emma running to the door with excited shouts of "Mr. Darby, Mr. Darby." Penelope appeared behind her, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "You both look half frozen. Sit before you fall down." That night as they sat around the table, Theo entertaining Emma with tales of his days as a young cowhand, Darby found himself watching Penelope, the graceful way she moved, the gentle firmness with which she managed her daughter, the strength that had carried her through unimaginable loss. For the first time in years, his cabin felt like more than shelter. It felt like something he'd never dared name. The following weeks settled into an unexpected routine. Darby and Theo worked the ranch. Penelope kept house and began teaching Emma her letters. On Sundays, Penelope read from her Bible at the table, a ritual Darby had abandoned years ago but found himself joining, sitting awkwardly with his hat in his hands. "You don't have to stay for the reading," she told him once, noticing his discomfort. "It's my table," he'd answered, then immediately regretted the harshness in his tone, but Penelope had only smiled. "So it is, Mr. Pine." As December deepened toward Christmas, the situation that had seemed so temporary began to feel strangely permanent. Darby found himself bringing home small gifts, a ribbon from the general store for Emma, a packet of tea for Penelope. He began taking Emma on short rides around the ranch on his gentlest mare, her squeals of delight warming something long frozen inside him. One evening, after Emma had been tucked into bed, Penelope joined Darby on the porch despite the cold. They stood silently, watching the stars prickle the vast Montana sky. "When do you expect to leave for Helena?" he asked finally, the question that had haunted him for weeks. Penelope was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. "My husband's brother." He wasn't exactly welcoming in his letters. "The truth is, I'm not certain we'd be welcome." "Then where will you go?" Darby asked, surprised by the tightness in his chest at the thought of them leaving at all. "I don't know," she admitted softly. "I have a little money saved, perhaps enough to start somewhere new." Darby wanted to say something, to suggest they might stay, that he'd grown accustomed to them, that the cabin felt empty when they weren't in it. But the words stuck in his throat, choked by years of believing attachment only led to pain. Instead, he nodded curtly and went to the barn, where he spent the night staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind and wondering why his carefully constructed isolation now felt like a prison rather than protection. Christmas Eve brought an unexpected visitor. Marshal Landon from the nearby town arrived just before sundown, stamping snow from his boots at Darby's door. "Tracking a man," he explained, accepting coffee from Penelope with a nod of thanks. "Garrett Vaughn, bank robber from Kansas City, headed this way, according to telegrams. Dangerous sort, killed a teller." Darby noticed how Penelope's hand trembled slightly as she set down the coffee pot. "Haven't seen any strangers," he said, "not since the snow set in." The marshal nodded, eyes lingering on Penelope and Emma. "Didn't realize you had family out here now, Pine. Thought you were determined to be the loneliest rancher in the territory." "They're just staying until spring," Darby said quickly. "Lost her husband on the trail." Something in Penelope's expression flickered, then settled into practiced calm. The marshal left soon after, promising to return if there was further news of the outlaw. That night, as Emma excitedly hung stockings by the fireplace, something Darby hadn't done since childhood, Penelope approached him quietly. "I should tell you something," she said, voice low so Emma wouldn't hear. "About my husband." Darby followed her to the porch, where the night air carried the bite of coming snow. Penelope wrapped her shawl tighter. "James wasn't a prospector," she said finally. "At least, not when I met him. He worked at the Mercantile Bank in St. Louis. We had a good life until," she took a deep breath, "until money went missing, a lot of money. James swore he was innocent, that he was being framed by the bank president's son. We fled in the night." Darby felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "Your husband was wanted." She nodded, eyes pleading for understanding. "He was a good man who made a terrible mistake. He was going to pay it back, make things right somehow. But then the fever took him, and now," her voice broke, "now it's just Emma and me, and I don't know what to do. There's nowhere we can go where the past won't follow." The revelation struck Darby like a blow. This woman he'd taken in, whose presence had begun to melt the ice around his heart, was the widow of a criminal. "If word got out, if the law connected her to the stolen money, does anyone know you're here?" he asked sharply. "Anyone who might connect you to the theft?" "No one," she whispered. "We left everything behind, changed our name. James was born a Walton, not a Whitaker." Darby paced the small porch, mind racing. He should tell her to leave, that he couldn't harbor fugitives, even inadvertently. It was exactly the complication he'd spent years avoiding by keeping to himself. But when he looked at her, shoulders squared despite her fear, determined to protect her daughter at any cost, he saw something of himself. Someone who'd lost everything and was fighting to build something new from the ashes. We'll speak no more of this, he said finally. What's past is past. Come spring, we'll figure out what's next. Penelope's relief was palpable. Thank you, she whispered and impulsively touched his arm, the first time she'd initiated contact between them. The warmth of her hand lingered long after she'd gone back inside. Christmas Day brought unexpected joy to the small cabin. Darby had ridden into town days earlier, returning with small gifts, a doll for Emma, a new shawl for Penelope. In turn, Penelope had secretly mended his worn coat and added new buttons carved from antler. They shared a meal of roast rabbit and potatoes, and even Theo joined them, bringing his fiddle to play carols that filled the cabin with music for the first time in Darby's memory. As January settled over the ranch, bringing the deepest cold of winter, the boundaries between temporary arrangement and something more permanent began to blur. Darby found excuses to return to the cabin during the day. Penelope began to plan improvements to the house as though she would be there to see them completed. One frigid afternoon, as Darby taught Emma to whittle simple shapes from soft pine, the girl looked up at him with solemn eyes. "Mama says we have to leave when the snow melts," she said, her small face pinched with worry. "I don't want to leave, I like it here with you." Darby's hands stilled on the wood. "Sometimes we have to do things we don't want to do, little one." "But why don't you want us to stay?" The question, innocent and direct as only a child could make it, struck at the heart of the conflict that had been building inside him for weeks. "It's complicated, Emma," he said finally. "That's what grown-ups say when they're scared," she replied with startling perception, before returning to her whittling. That night, unable to sleep, Darby stood at his window watching moonlight reflect off the snow. The ranch had never felt more like home, yet never more at risk. If he asked them to stay, he'd be opening himself to the very loss he'd structured his life to avoid. If they left, the emptiness they'd leave behind would be worse than what he'd known before. February brought a thaw, then a hard freeze that coated the world in ice. Darby was checking cattle in the south pasture when Theo came riding hard, his horse slipping on the frozen ground. "Rider coming," Theo gasped. "Matches the marshal's description of that bank robber headed straight for the house." Fear unlike anything Darby had known seized him. He spurred his horse homeward, racing across the frozen landscape with one thought hammering in his mind. Penelope and Emma were alone. He arrived to find a stranger's horse tethered outside his cabin. Drawing his rifle, Darby approached cautiously. Through the window he could see a man standing inside, tall, well-dressed despite trail dust, with a gun visible at his hip. Darby burst through the door to find Penelope backed against the wall, Emma behind her skirts, and the stranger standing in the center of the room. "Step away from them," Darby commanded, rifle raised. The man turned slowly, hands slightly raised. "Easy now, I'm just having a conversation with the lady." "Who are you?" Darby demanded. "Walter Simmons," the man replied smoothly, "bank investigator from St. Louis." "Been tracking the Waltons for months." His cold gaze shifted to Penelope, or the Whitakers as they're calling themselves now. "He says I have to go back to St. Louis," Penelope said, her voice steady despite her evident fear, "that I'm complicit in James's theft." "The lady's husband stole $8,000, Simmons explained, "money that belongs to the bank. Since he had the poor manners to die before facing justice, the debt falls to his widow." "I told you I don't have it," Penelope insisted. "James said he hid it somewhere safe before he fell ill. He died before telling me where." Simmons's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Then I suggest you start remembering, Mrs. Whitaker, or it's prison for you and an orphanage for the girl." The threat ignited something primal in Darby. "You're not taking them anywhere," he said, voice low and dangerous. "This isn't your concern, rancher, this is bank business." "They're under my protection," Darby replied. "That makes it my business." Simmons laughed coldly. "Protection? Is that what you call it? Harboring fugitives is a crime, friend." "So is threatening women and children at gunpoint," Darby countered. "Now get out of my house." Simmons's hand dropped to his sidearm. "I'm not leaving without her and whatever she knows about the money." What happened next unfolded in heartbeats. Simmons drew, but Darby had anticipated the move. A single shot rang out and the bank man dropped, clutching his shoulder and cursing. "Next one won't be so merciful," Darby warned, keeping his rifle trained on the wounded man. "Theo," he called out the door, "tie this man up and ride for the marshal. Tell him we've got a situation." Hours later, Marshal Landon sat at Darby's table, reviewing papers Simmons had carried, including identification confirming he was indeed from the bank, but also revealing a history of dubious tactics in recovering funds. He's wanted in 2 territories for excessive force, the marshal explained. Bank cut him loose months ago, but he kept working the case, likely hoping to find the money for himself. What happens now? Penelope asked, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. There's still the matter of the stolen money, the marshal said gently. The bank will want it back. Penelope's face fell. I told the truth. I don't know where it is. Darby, who had been silent throughout the interview, finally spoke. What if it were returned? Would the charges be dropped? The marshal considered. Banks care more about money than justice, generally speaking. If the funds were recovered, they might be persuaded to show leniency, especially to a widow with a child. After the marshal left, taking the wounded Simmons with him, a heavy silence fell over the cabin. Emma had been sent to bed, but Darby and Penelope sat by the dying fire, the day's events hanging between them. I should have told you everything from the beginning, Penelope said finally. You deserved the truth. Would you have stayed if I'd asked? Darby's question surprised them both. Penelope looked up, eyes searching his. Would you have asked? The vulnerability in her question broke something loose in him. I've spent years believing that caring for people only leads to loss, that the safest way to live is to need no one. He stared into the embers. But these past months with you and Emma, I've started wondering if I've had it backward all along, if maybe the only way to truly survive out here is to have something worth fighting for. Tears filled Penelope's eyes. I never meant to bring trouble to your door. Trouble finds everyone eventually, Darby replied. Facing it alone isn't strength, it's just loneliness wearing a brave face. In that moment, with firelight casting long shadows and the weight of decisions pressing down, Darby realized the truth that had been growing in him all these months. His carefully constructed isolation had never been protection, it had been fear masquerading as independence. The next morning, Darby rode out alone. He returned after nightfall, his expression unreadable as he handed Penelope a mud-stained canvas bag. James told you he hid it somewhere safe, he said quietly. I've been thinking about that. A man traveling with his family knowing he was ill, he'd want it close but not obvious. Penelope opened the bag with trembling hands to find stacks of bills inside. Where? Your wagon, inside the seat bench. There was a loose board that didn't match the others. Darby's voice was steady. Take it to the marshal tomorrow, have him wire the bank, make things right. Tears spilled down Penelope's cheeks. Why are you doing this for us? Darby took her hands in his, the gesture awkward but sincere. Because I want you to be free to choose your path forward, without fear chasing you. Without the past deciding your future. A week later, they received confirmation. The bank had agreed to drop all charges in exchange for the return of the stolen money. Penelope stood in the doorway of the cabin, letter in hand, her expression a mixture of disbelief and relief. It's over, she whispered, truly over. Darby nodded, watching Emma play in the yard with the puppy he'd brought home the previous day. A gift he'd told himself was just to keep the child occupied, though they all knew better. Spring's coming, he said, nodding toward the south pasture where patches of green were beginning to emerge from the melting snow. You'll be able to travel soon, if that's still your plan. Penelope studied him. Is that what you want? For us to leave? The moment stretched between them, filled with everything unsaid. Darby thought of the cabin as it had been before they arrived, neat, orderly, and hollow as an empty shell. He thought of Emma's laughter, of Penelope's quiet strength, of how his ranch had transformed from a place of exile to a home under their influence. No, he said finally, the admission costing him the last of his careful defenses. I want you to stay. Both of you. I want to build something here that isn't just about surviving, something that might even be worth the risk of losing someday. Penelope stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. Are you certain once we put down roots, we might not be so easy to uproot again? I'm counting on it, Darby replied, and for the first time since she'd arrived on his land, he reached for her deliberately, drawing her into an embrace that felt like coming home after a long journey. On a bright May morning, as wildflowers bloomed across the Montana plains, Darby Pine and Penelope Whitaker were married under an arch of twisted willow branches, before the small community that had gradually become part of their lives. Emma stood beside them, beaming in a new dress, clutching flowers she'd picked herself. Theo played his fiddle while the ranch hands and townspeople gathered to witness the union of two people who had found each other against all odds, a young cowboy who'd believed love had no place on the frontier, and a widow who'd thought she'd left hope buried alongside her first husband. That evening, as they sat on the porch of the newly expanded cabin, watching the sun set over land that now truly felt like home, Penelope leaned her head against Darby's shoulder. "What changed?" she asked softly. "What made you willing to risk caring again?" Darby watched Emma chasing fireflies in the gathering dusk, her laughter carrying across the yard. He thought about the fear that had ruled him for so long, the belief that love was a liability in a harsh land. How backward he'd had it all along. "I realized something," he said, taking Penelope's hand in his. "The frontier doesn't make love impossible, it makes it necessary. We don't survive out here by walling ourselves off. We survive by finding people worth building a life with." As stars emerged in the darkening sky, Darby Pine looked at the family he'd never sought but had somehow found. The family that had turned his solitary existence into something rich with meaning. The lesson he'd learned in the hardest way possible: that home wasn't a place to hide from the world's dangers, but a heart brave enough to love despite them. And in that moment, surrounded by the night sounds of the ranch and the gentle breathing of the woman beside him, Darby finally understood the truth that had been waiting for him all along. That sometimes the bravest thing a man can do in the wild country isn't to face it alone, but to open his door to those who need shelter, and in doing so, find that they've sheltered him in return.